الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. After praising Allah Ta'ala, glorifying Him, mentioning His pureness, we then send salutations upon our beloved Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May Allah Ta'ala send upon him abundant salutations and blessings from us. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. We invoke Allah Ta'ala in this way and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam sending salutations so that whatever knowledge we are going to gain, we gain the nur and the barakat, the blessings, the spiritual light and enlightenment from Allah Ta'ala in this quest of knowledge that we are in. Because this is our knowledge. Sacred knowledge is not just knowledge of just black and white knowledge that we are seeking and reading from, but this is actual knowledge which is a pass on of enlightened nur from one person to another, connecting all the way back to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam through our teachers. May Allah Ta'ala grant us that spiritual knowledge, that spiritual enlightenment that will then bring us on to practice, because that's the purpose of the knowledge, not just to gain information, but to make that information that we are gaining into practice, and that's what beneficial knowledge will then be, knowledge which will draw us closer to Allah Ta'ala. So we ask Allah Ta'ala to grant us this type of knowledge that will bring us closer to Him and to His pleasure, to gain His pleasure. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. And we make dua for all of you. Allah Ta'ala grant you His abundant blessings and bless also your families. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. So today we will be doing the mandatory requisites, the wajibat of the prayer of the salat. So he'll be going through 13 of them famously, but there are a few more which I will mention the concept of, at least one more if I remember. So we will be talking about that inshallah. Today's lesson will be all about the wajibat, the integrals, and we talked about last time how if a wajib integral is missed, then it's not like the prayer is incomplete, is not done, though the prayer is deficient in a way, but the prayer is acceptable because the arkan, the necessity, the necessary actions, the arkan, integrals have been completed, so the person's obligation is then done. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi wahdahu wassalatu wassalamu ala man la nabiyya ba'dah. So now the mandatory requisites, the wajibat of the prayer. So now we're talking about the mandatory obligations, wajibat of the prayer themselves. Amongst them are the following. So they're going to say, he's going to list some of them. The reason is because it's difficult to list them exhaustively, but the concepts will be given here. And if something else goes wrong, then if one of those obligatory wajibat or mandatory wajibat are violated, then a person will have to do a sajda. So there's a concept here, which is that the wajibat here that we're discussing, mandatory wajibat, what's the difference between them and the necessary integrals that a person must do. I explained this previously in regards to the obligatory integrals, that if a person doesn't do them, the prayer doesn't count. There's no way of making up for it besides actually doing it. But in these wajibat, if a person misses out one of them or violates any of them, then if it's done by mistake, then a person can make up for them by performing a sajda of forgetfulness. We call the sajda of sahu, of mistake, you can say. So this sajda of mistake is that a person at the end of their prayer, so they've done at-tahiyyat lillahi wa salawatu, all the way till the end of at-tahiyyat. After at-tahiyyat, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. After they finish that, they say do one salam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, one salam. After doing one salam, they will do two prostrations, two sajdas. They do 2 sajdas, and then they do the at-tahiyyat all over again. So basically they've kind of backtracked to the sajda that they already did. You can understand like that. So they're just doing 2 sajdas. Do sajda, subhanallah, get up, do sajda again, subhanallah, 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 and get up again, and then do at-tahiyyat again, do the durood and the dua after durood, and then end the prayer in that way normally. So 1 salam, and then you start from the 2 sajdas again in essence. So this is the prostration of mistake or forgetfulness, you can say. And this is only allowed or should only be done when a wajib, which we're talking about, is violated or omitted mistakenly. If a person missed out a wajib or violated one of the wajibat that we're talking about, the mandatory requisites, purposefully, not by mistake, by purpose, then they cannot make up for this by a sajda of sahwa. They cannot make up for this. The person just will be sinful, and it will be wajib for the person to repeat the prayer. Likewise, if a person forgot to do the sajda of sahw, so they missed out mistakenly, they violated the wajib, and later on they remembered, oh no, I was meant to do the sajda of sahw. Now that prayer also becomes wajib to repeat, though the integrals are done. So now it's no longer fard for a person to pray. You won't be questionable for that prayer, but it will be remaining wajib for the person to repeat that prayer because you've missed out a wajib. That's the concept. You haven't missed a fard out, so therefore your fara'id are done, that's fulfilled, but meaning with Allah the fard is complete, but the wajib is missed, so therefore it's going to remain wajib to repeat the prayer. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of what these wajibat are all about, and in terms of mistakenly doing it and purposefully doing it. If you mistakenly do it, you can make up for it by sajda sahw. But if you purposefully violate or miss it out or something, then it's obviously going to be disliked, makruh tahrimi, close to haram, as well as obviously a person will be sinful, and there's no way of making up for it besides repeating that prayer now. So this is what he's talking about here. So the first one is to say the words Allahu Akbar specifically, as opposed to other phrases of remembrance, meaning remembrance of Allah, to begin every prayer, i.e. for the tahrima. So when saying the takbir of tahrima, Allahu Akbar, so you say Allahu Akbar and you don't say something else like Allahu Ajal, Allahu Kabir, or anything else. Don't say anything else. If you say something else, then you have violated this wajib, which is wajib to say Allahu Akbar, that itself. So this is the first wajib that it has mentioned. Number 2, to recite the Fatiha, as well as a surah or 3 verses. So like I explained previously in the Qiraat, now comes the 3 verses discussion. So to recite a surah or at least 3 verses after it in any 2 rak'ah of the obligatory prayer and in all rak'ahs of the voluntary prayer. So I explained this as well, what he means by all the rak'ahs of the voluntary prayer and any 2 rak'ahs of the obligatory prayer. I've explained that previously, same discussion goes there. But in terms of to recite the Fatiha, as well as the surah, or 3 verses, or 1 big long verse, so this is all wajib now. So this is obviously not behind the Imam. So if you're reciting behind the Imam, then this is omitted. There's no Fatiha, there is no recital of surah or 3 verses or 1 long verse, because the Imam is doing it for you. But if you're reciting alone, or if you are praying any other prayers that you would pray alone, wajibs, the sunnahs, the nafil prayers or something like this, then it will be wajib to recite Fatiha and also to recite a surah after the Fatiha. So both are different wajibs. Fatiha in itself is wajib, and reciting the surah or 3 verses or 1 long verse is also a separate wajib. But it's obviously made it all together over here. It's no problem, just to understand it. It's pretty easy to understand, hopefully. When we say Fatiha, we mean the whole Fatiha. the full Fatiha, to recite every verse is wajib. So reciting Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, reciting every verse is necessary, is wajib. And then after Fatiha to recite a surah is also, or like I explained, surah or 3 verses or 1 long verse. So 3 verses, the 3 shortest verses that I mentioned in the books of fiqh, like I explained already, ثم نظر, ثم عبس وبصر, ثم أدبر واستكبر. So this is in Surah Muddathir, verse number 21 to 23. This is a short passage. According to some, it's the shortest passage that a person can recite in all in one. There are other shorter verses, but not following it 2 shorter verses as well. So anyway, 3 short verses, or it could be 1 long verse, which equals the amount of letters in this short verse. But it could be a long verse like Ayatul Kursi. Ayatul Kursi is a very long verse. Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum. 1 long verse all the way till the end. So that's 1 verse. So a person can recite that 1 verse, it's fine. 2 or any other verse which is long enough for the equivalent letters in this ثم نظر ثم عبس وبصر ثم أدبر واستكبر. ثم ثم نظر ثم عبس وبصر ثم أدبر واستكبر. So you know these letters a person can recite a verse which is similar to this 1 long verse. So this will equate to, this will be equivalent to the 3 small short verses. And that's obviously is replacing a surah. So you don't have to recite a surah, though it's recommended that a person recites a full surah. So this is a wajib. And what's also wajib is to recite this surah after Fatiha in the order. I think that's going to come later on anyway, but if it doesn't come, just to recite it in that order. So that's also necessary. So you can't read Fatiha and recite the Fatiha again and then recite the surah. So then you have missed out the wajib, because you should have recited the surah after the Fatiha, but you read another Fatiha in between. Likewise, if a person read majority of the Fatiha and then started all over again, they've now broken up the recital of Fatiha and then the surah after it, which should have followed. So these are problems. A person should not do this. Some people do this because they become very fixated with the recital, or they start doubting whether they've recited properly or not, and things like this. So they carry on repeating verses. You should not be repeating verses. This is all wiswas. This is all the thoughts that shaitan is bringing in to make prayer difficult. So a person should not entertain these thoughts. So anyway, that's what this is all about here. Number 3 is to do the above recitation specifically in the first 2 rak'ahs of the obligatory prayer. I'll explain this in the next. So number 3, to do the above recitation, so reciting Fatiha or reciting the surah as well, specifically in the first 2 rak'ats of the obligatory prayer. So because we talked about if a person was to pray 4 rak'ats of fard prayer, dhuhr for example, and the person, they prayed Fatiha and surah in the first and the 3rd rak'at, the obligatory recital is done, but the obligatory fard arkan recital is done, but they have messed up the wajib, because it was wajib to have recited that in the first 2 rak'ats. The Fatiha, surah, should have been recited in the first 2 rak'ats. So because they've messed up the ordering, they've not prayed it in the first 2 rak'ats, they're going to have to do sajda of prostration afterwards to make up for this. So obviously if they did not do this by purpose. So to do the above recital specifically in the first 2 rak'ats of the obligatory prayer, I'm sure this is understood now. Then moving to the next one, number 4, to perform prostration with most of the forehead and the hard part of the nose. So performing the prostration with most of the forehead on the ground, because it's hard to get the whole forehead, because obviously forehead goes round. So getting majority of the forehead onto the ground, as well as the hard part of the nose, again as much as you can onto the ground. This is a wajib here. If a person is injured somewhere then obviously they can be excused a little bit, because there's a valid excuse, there's a valid reason for them to miss this out. But a person should be performing like this. But you cannot suffice upon the nose only. So if a person puts the nose only down without putting the forehead, this is not sufficient. Forehead is the main thing, which we talked about in the integrals. So the forehead plus the hard part of the nose, placing all of that down onto the ground when performing prostration, when doing sajda. This is a wajib for the person to do. So if a person has an imama on like me, and it's coming out, protruding outside beyond, like they've wrapped it around so many times that it's coming and protruding, blocking the forehead from touching the ground. So then a person should not be doing this. A person should not be blocking the forehead to be getting onto the ground. Yeah, only if that is on top of the actual forehead, then that can be done. But obviously, it's still important that the person moves their imama back so that they're able to do it on the actual head. Otherwise, it will lead to dislike. If a person was to play without a valid reason, if a person's placing down a cloth, or they're placing down their scarf, the woman is placing her scarf onto the ground. So these are things that need to be understood here, that a person should prostrate in this manner, with the forehead as well as the nose onto the ground. Number 5, to perform the second prostration before moving on to other parts of the prayer. So the order it's in essence talking about here, the 5th one, that the order of the prayer must be done in a way whereby one prostration follows the second prostration, with obviously in between a small paused sitting, which we call a jalsa. So we do sajda, and then you sit for a short pause, and then you perform another prostration, another sajda. So performing one after the other, this is also wajib. A person must do this. If a person does not do this, performs one sajda, then starts to do something else, then remembers, and then does the other sajda afterwards, they have missed out a wajib. So they will have to perform, if it's done by mistake, they will have to perform the sajda of forgetfulness or of mistake. Number 6, to be still for at least a moment in every integral of the prayer. So here there's a little bit of discussion that being still in every posture, which we call ta'dil of arkan, ta'dilul arkan, which some of the other schools consider to be integral. So other schools do consider this to be integral. We consider it to be wajib. It's a mandatory wajib. A person must do this, and if a person misses this out, then they will have to do, if it's by mistake, then they will have to do again sajda of the prostration of forgetfulness or mistake. Otherwise, if it's done by poor purpose, the person will have to repeat their prayer. They will be sinful, and leaving the prayer in this way will be disliked, if prohibitively disliked, if a person was not to make up for their prayer. So praying very quickly without pausing in each posture. Pausing in each posture to what extent now? To the extent that a person can say Subhanallah. So you go down into ruku, for example, and you stay there for enough time that a person says Subhanallah, then you get up. That much is what he's talking about here, which is obligatory. This is the bare minimum that a person must do to fulfill the ta'adil of arkan. Some scholars have said good practice is to allow, when you go into that posture, in any posture you go into, allow the limbs to settle. So when you go into ruku, allow the limbs to have settled in that position. You have settled in that position, now you get back up. Not like this. So you've not actually settled in that posture. So you just got down and you come back up, like some people unfortunately do. So that is them missing out this wajib. So they must get down, settled, and get back up. Settled, get back up. So you've actually settled. That is by minimum what some scholars have mentioned, that this is what which fulfills the ta'dil of arkan. But the easiest way to understand it is how we said it already, is you get down, Subhanallah, get back up. That much is minimum a person must do. That's as an example of ruku. Each posture must be the same. So when you're getting up, into that qawma before going into sujood. So a person did ruku and he got up, same thing goes there. Not like this. Some people are in ruku, they get up and they go all the way down again straight away. They don't even get up fully. Some people just get up that much and go down straight away. This is not right. A person must get up. Subhanallah, they can say that much at least. Not that they say it, they won't say it. Obviously, they have to recite the tasbihat that are mentioned. The Rabbana lakal hamd or Rabbana wa lakal hamd. The person must recite Sami Allahu liman hamida, Rabbana lakal hamd, and then get down. So that's what you would recite. But a person, in order to understand what we're talking about here, when you get up, subhanallah, a person stood up for that much amount of time, then that mandatory wajib has been now fulfilled. So every integral of the prayer must be done with this much. Integral of the prayer, we talked about the example of the qawma as well, but integral ruku, the sujood, every integral must be done with this particular pausing. The sitting between the sajdas, the jalsas we talked about, this is also considered from amongst the integrals here for this purpose. Why? Because sitting in between the sajdas, if you do not sit, then that means you will not be able to perform two sajdas. So in order for the sajda, first one, to be distinguished from the second sajda, which are both integrals, you have to have in between a small sitting. Because if you just got up slightly and you went back down, that is still the first prostration. That all counts as one prostration because you never actually distinguished between the first and the second prostration. So that is why anything that's necessary for you to be able to fulfill the arkan, that would also be given the ruling of an integral. So that's why the jalsa here, though in itself it's not integral, but it's integral because of it being able to lead towards the other integral, which is the second sajda. You will not be able to do it without having sat in that position. So that position of jalsa also, for that, it's also necessary for the person to sit for this duration in that position as well. Then number 7 we will do is the first sitting. So sitting for the first qa'dah after the second rak'at in at-tahiyyat, again sitting for that posture. This is also considered from amongst the mandatory wajibs, actions. This is obviously in a prayer which is not of 2 units, not in a fard. For example, in a fajr fard 2 rak'ats, then the first sitting, the second rakat sitting is the final sitting. So there is no first sitting as such, because that first sitting is the final sitting. So we're not talking about the 2 rakat prayers. We're talking about either 3 rakat wajib or 3 rakat of maghrib, or we're talking about the 4 rakat prayers, any 4 rakat prayer. So in them prayers, that first sitting is a wajib. If a person forgetfully misses it, then a person will have to do the sajda of the forgetfulness again, the prostration of forgetfulness or mistake again. And if a person did it by purpose, like we talked about, then you can't make up for it. It's going to be sinful and you're going to have to repeat that prayer. As far as if a person misses it is concerned, so if a person misses it and stood up, as long as you haven't fully stood up, you're getting up and you're in this position that you're now nearly up, and then you remember, oh, it's my second rakat, I have to sit back, I have to sit. So you can sit back down. You're allowed to sit back down as long as you haven't fully stood up. If you fully stood up, now you have started your third rakat, even though you haven't started the recital, because you are now in your qiyam position. You are in now standing position of your third rakat. You are not allowed to then sit down into that second rakat. You're not allowed to go back and perform that first sitting. You have now missed it. You would have to do sajda anyway. Okay, this is the reason. The reason is because you have now got up into a fard, a rukn, because standing is a fard, one of the integrals. So you've now stood up into an integral, and sitting was a wajib. The second rakat sitting was a wajib. So you can't go from a higher posture once you've already started that. neglect that in essence to now go back into something which is of a lower status, which is a wajib, which is of a lower status. You can't do that. So you've already stood up. But anytime before that, you haven't stood up fully yet, right? Even if your hands were not close to your knees, yes? So you're still not fully stood up yet. So because you haven't fully stood up into that posture of that rukn, that standing position of the third rakat, because you are in a position which is not fard. This is not a fard position. This is not any of these positions that you are still in. This is not a rukn position. So therefore, you are allowed to sit back down. And if you sat back down, then there is nothing on you. You do not have to do any sajda of sahwa. You do not have to do a sajda of forgetfulness because you did not fully stand up. You did not miss, in essence. You got up and you go back down again. It's fine, no problem. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah. So the sajda of prostration, of forgetfulness would only be necessary if you actually missed it, or if you fully stood up and then you sat back down, which you should not have done anyway. Okay, you should not be doing that, like I said. But if a person did it, then they will have to do that sajda because they have already stood up fully. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. Okay, so now number 8, to recite the entire tashahhud in both sittings. So the first sitting, a person should recite the entire tashahhud, and this is mandatory wajib to do, and to recite the entire one. And also in the final sitting, a person has to recite the entire tashahhud. So this must be done in both the sittings. If a person misses part of it, or doesn't know part of it, you can say, and then misses it because of that reason. Or if a person misses it mistakenly, then a person can make up for it by doing sajda of forgetfulness. Not if a person missed it by purpose. So this is the recital of tashahhud itself. So we talked about sitting for the duration of tashahhud. In the final sitting is integral, but reciting the tashahhud itself is wajib. Number 9, to say the word as-salam, meaning assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Saying at least salam itself, that's wajib. Saying assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, all of it, the full thing, is obviously optional. Is the sunnah. But saying salam on its own twice is wajib. It's mandatory. A person must say this and end the prayer in this way. If a person does not end the prayer in this way, then the salat will remain wajib to repeat, will remain mandatory wajib to repeat that prayer, because they did not say the salam. They did not end the prayer in the way they should have ended the prayer. So that's that, number 9. Number 10 is to recite the qunut in the witr prayer. So reciting the dua al-qunut, Allahumma inna nasta'inuk, until the end. وَنَسْتَغْفِرُكَ وَنُؤْمِنُ بِكَ, reciting the whole thing until the end. That dua al-qunut, it is reciting it itself is wajib, it's a mandatory wajib. A person must recite this. The next one, number 11, is to recite the 6 extra takbirs in the 2 Eid prayers. So the Eid prayer, according to us Hanafis, is with 6 additional takbirs. So you've got 3 in the first rakat and 3 takbirs in the second rakat. So reciting these additional takbirs is wajib. Every one of them, every one of the 6 takbirs are wajib. If a person misses them, then they would have to do sajda of sahw. They would have to do, if the person misses them mistakenly, then they would do a sajda of sahw, which is the prostration of forgetfulness or mistake. The next one, number 12, is for the imam to recite Quran out loud in the first 2 rakats of the loud obligatory prayers. So basically reciting aloud in the audible prayers. So in the Fajr, Maghrib and Isha, the imam should recite out loud in the first 2 rakats. If the imam does not recite out loud, then they have missed out the the mandatory wajib, and they would have to do sajda sahwa at the end. Now, if the Imam started the prayer, practically if the Imam started Allahu Akbar, started the prayer, and they started reciting silently, inaudibly, they started reciting, they thought maybe they forgot, their mind was somewhere else, they were absent-minded, they started reciting, they recited themselves quietly, and then they remembered, oh no, it's Maghrib, or it's Isha, or it's Fajr. Then they started reciting again, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, loudly. Then, if they have recited silently, the amount by which the salat will be done, the obligatory amount that the salat is done by, then they would have to do sajda of sahw. They would have to do the sajda because they mistakenly recited quietly when they should have recited audibly. Okay, so the amount that is excused, you can say, by which the Imam will not have to do sajda sahw, is the amount which is less than the amount by which salat is sufficient. And we talked about that in the integrals. So the Imam recites only, for example, Alhamdulillah, quietly, Alhamdulillah Rabbil, oh yeah. After he's reciting Alhamdulillah Rabbil, oh yeah, then they started reciting very loudly, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, they started reciting loudly, then that is fine, that's excused, because this is not a full verse, nor is it sufficient, equivalent to be equal to something which the salat will be sufficient by. So hopefully this makes sense. If a person is praying on their own, these prayers, the prayers in which you audibly recite the Fajr, the Maghrib, the Isha, or the Witr even, if a person is praying these prayers on their own, they are allowed to read aloud. So you can read aloud, you can do that as well. It's perfectly fine, as long as it doesn't disturb other people, which a person should be mindful of, then they can read a little bit loud. But not in the other prayers, which number 13 is going to discuss. So for both the Imam and the one praying alone, so both the Imam and the one praying alone, to recite Quran silently and in inaudible method, basically silently, in the other rakats of the obligatory prayers. So in the third and fourth rakat of obligatory prayers, as well as the Dhuhr and Asr prayer, the inaudible prayers, the Imam as well as the person praying on their own has to recite silently. Now this is the same ruling for a woman, that a woman will not read aloud, will not read the prayer aloud, meaning not read the Quran aloud in any of the rakats, in any of the prayers, because that's the ruling for the woman as well. So this is all considered to be amongst the wajibat. Like we explained the rulings of the wajibat, if a person misses it, or a person violates any of this mistakenly, then the sajda of mistake would be necessary. If a person does not do the sajda of mistake, the person makes a mistake and they do not do the sajda, then then they would have to repeat that prayer, though it would be wajib to repeat the prayer, not necessary to repeat the prayer. So this now brings us to an end of the wajibat that the book mentions, though there is one concept which is quite commonly violated, one thing that he did not mention. I think it was mentioned at the beginning somewhere in the footnote. I think it's on footnote somewhere. I think I remember reading it. I'm sure you can find it. Anyway, the point is that if a person delays, there's a concept here that if a person delays some other wajib or another integral is delayed, so then delaying of that also leads to so for example, a person was sitting in the second rakat, in the first sitting, first at-tahiyyat. So after at-tahiyyat, they carried on reciting in a fard prayer. They carried on reciting the durood, which they should have stood up. Really, they should have stood up into their third rakat. But instead of standing up into their third rakat, they delayed that standing into their third rakat, which is a rukn, which is a integral, and they delayed it and they started to recite Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. So if they did this, they recited the durood. So because they've delayed the integral forgetfully, they did it forgetfully, then this would lead to the necessity of such a sahwa, because this is also to do, the next integral without a delay. So this is something which, so if a person recites this, so if they did Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, the dal of Muhammad, they got to that. If they said Allahumma salli ala Muhammad and they remembered and then they got up, there's nothing. There's no sajda of forgetfulness to do, of the mistake to do here. It's all fine, they got up in time. But if they said Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, they got to the dal and they carried on reciting even more, in fact, they would have to do such a sahwa now, because this much is enough. Because Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, the idea behind it is one sentence. So you've delayed now because you've said a sentence which is fully, it has its own meaning. But anything beyond that, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, is not a sentence. So you've not actually delayed fully yet. So that's the idea behind it. There are other opinions, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, some people say. But this is the more sound opinion, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. You did that much, now this much is sufficient delay for you to now be necessitating such a sahwa now, because you've missed out this wajib here, which is not to delay the next rukn. But one concept here, if in a third or fourth rakat of the fard prayer, the third rakat or the fourth rakat of the fard prayer, in which a person recites Fatiha, and after Fatiha they go into ruku, but they recited a surah with it, mistakenly they recited Fatiha and a surah, then this is not a delay which necessitates a sajda. Somebody will think now that you're delaying your ruku. Yes, but the concept here to fully appreciate and understand is that you've not done something beyond the remit of that particular standing. So the standing posture that you did, that standing posture is the posture in which you should be doing qira'ah. You should be saying Fatiha and doing qira'at of Quran basically. Though you've added a surah, you're still doing qira'ah in the place in which there is qira'ah. So you're doing qira'at in which we call mawdi'ul qira'ah, in the place where qira'at takes place. So this cannot be a delay. It's like a person reciting Surah Al-Fatiha and they're taking their time, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, as opposed to somebody reciting very fast. So are you going to say that the person who recited very slowly, they delayed the ruku now? No, they haven't, because they're still reciting. So recital is in a place of recital, so this is not going to be a delay. Does that make sense? Whereas the durood that a person does in a second rakat, that's being done in a place where it's not meant to be. The durood is not meant to be in a second rakat. It's only meant to be at tahiyyat. After at tahiyyat, you're meant to stand up. There is no durood after that. So you did something extra now in a place where that was not meant to be there. So this is now a delay. So that's what it means by delaying the next rukn, by doing something. This delay will then necessitate as such a sahwa. You've missed out the wajib, obligatory wajib, which you are meant to have done. So hopefully this all makes sense. This is the concepts of the wajibat have all now been completed. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Now just to summarize what we've done today. So we talked about the wajibat, the mandatory wajibat of the prayer, of the salat. We talked about 13 of them. The 13 of them, just to get a concept of, is firstly saying the Allahu Akbar, recital of Allahu Akbar itself when starting the prayer and not saying anything else. Then reciting Fatiha, reciting the Fatiha fully is wajib, as well as that reciting after it surah, and in that order as well, reciting Fatiha first, then reciting surah after that, or anything which substitutes the surah, 3 verses or 1 long verse, and doing this in the first 2 rak'ats of the fard prayer, and in all the rakat of the any other prayer besides the fard prayer. So this is all wajib. Then when prostrating, doing sujood, doing it on the forehead as well as the hard part of the nose, this was also wajib. Then to perform the second prostration before, meaning doing the second sajda before moving on to any other part of the prayer. Then to sit for at least a moment in every integral, meaning doing ta'deel of arkan, calmly being in each integral, and we talked about that this jalsa is also included in this. Then sitting in the first sitting, which is at the end of the second rakat in a 4 or 3 unit prayer. So sitting for that time in that sitting is also wajib, and then to recite the tashahhud in that sitting as well as in the final sitting. So recital of the tashahhud itself is wajib. Then saying as-salam, saying the salam itself is wajib, not the assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. The alaikum wa rahmatullah is sunnah part, but as-salam itself is wajib. A person must recite as-salam at least. Then the 2 of them though, he has to be both as-salam, that's the wajib being done. Then the next one was to recite the qunut itself. Allahumma inna nasta'inuka wa nastaghfiruka wa nu'minu bihi wa natawakkalu alayka wa nathni alayka al-khayr wa nashkuruka wa la nakfuruka wa nakhla'u wa natruku man yafjuruka. Allahumma iyyaka na'budu wa laka nusalli wa nasjudu wa ilayka nas'a wa nahfidu wa narju rahmataka wa nakhsha 'adhabaka inna 'adhabaka bil kuffari mulhiq. So reciting this whole thing, which you can find, I'm sure, on the internet, the dua al-qunut and of the Hanafis, and this is all available. Then to recite the 6 additional takbirs in the Eid prayers, so reciting every 6 of them, all the 6 of them, this is wajib. Then for the Imam to recite aloud in the audible prayers, Fajr, meaning the Fajr, the Maghrib, the Isha, as well as the Eid prayers, as well as the Jumu'ah prayer, and Witr prayers if you're praying in congregation in Ramadan, for example. So all of this is going to be recited aloud. And any other prayers, I mean, I explained there as well that a person, if you're praying alone, then you can also pray aloud. It's optional for a man to do this. And then lastly, in the 3rd and 4th rakat of the fard prayers, as well as all the rakats of the Dhuhr and Asr prayer, the inaudible prayers, reciting silently. And a woman will follow this particular ruling as well. So these were all the wajibat, the mandatory wajibs.